Ukraine Today is joined by strategy consultant from Australia, Mr. Mark Textor. Mr. Textor, welcome to Ukraine Today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mr. Textor, I understand that one of the reasons of your trip to Ukraine this time is to participate in the opening of Australia-Ukraine Chamber of Commerce. Can you tell us what are the perspectives, what are the opportunities for the Australian business here in Ukraine? Are there many of them?
Well, this was born of what I'd call tragic awareness. Obviously, the awareness to Ukraine became very important a year ago after the tragic incident of MH17. But once Ukraine was in the limelight, it got a lot of Australians, even paradoxically through tragedy, got to learn about this emerging economy that, despite all its troubles, offered wonderful opportunities. And there's some very strong parallels, a strong minerals industry, so some skills and expertise that can be swapped there, strong agricultural industry, heavy industry, and also emerging technology markets. So, strangely enough, despite the distance, we have something in common but besides tragedy.
Mr. Textor, I understand that you are advising various governments of various countries on reputational matters.
Yes.
If you were hired by the government of Ukraine to work for the Ukrainian government, what would be your immediate advice to the Ukrainian government?
Well, seize the opportunity. It's no good avoiding the fact that there's conflict. But the remarkable thing about Ukraine, in the eyes of many around the world, is despite the difficulties in the east, despite Russian aggression, ordinary Ukrainians are getting on with their job, trying to improve their lives, trying to build businesses, trying to establish an emerging democratic model, and putting the past behind. So very much an idea that Ukraine, while everything's not perfect, not all the corruption is gone, not all business opportunities have been opened up, but Ukraine is trying its hardest to move forward to a better place. Meanwhile, they contrast that to Russia, who seems to be going backwards into a state of sort of mafioso-like being. So that's admired, and I think there's tremendous opportunity for Ukraine to build on that admiration, that you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can handle the difficulties of the past and the difficulties in the East and still pursue a new form of democracy. Young Ukrainians and old Ukrainians are coming back. I know a couple of my friends in Australia have come back to the Ukraine to seize those opportunities. And that's a great story to tell the world. So it's not all gloom and doom, because people want to support hope. People want to support opportunity, and that's the opportunity for Ukraine.
You mentioned seizing the opportunity, but a lot of people, a lot of businessmen, foreign businessmen who are working in Ukraine, they're all complaining about corruption.
Yeah.
And moreover, even with the war raging in eastern Ukraine, they say that corruption is a primary evil of Ukrainian economy right now.
Yeah.
How much true is that for the Australian businessmen, for the Australian businesses, and aren't they concerned about the war raging some 600 kilometers away from the capital, Kyiv?
Well, as they walk through Kiev, it's not immediately apparent that there is a war going on. But as to corruption, it's not what necessarily whether something exists or not. It's whether steps have been taken to improve something. So what is seen, and I'm not going to comment on the extent of corruption, but what is seen is it's gone from an institutionalised system before the revolutions to something that's now more of an overhang and fragmented. And so steps are being taken. But there's other things they look at, the amount of red tape in the system. So the more red tape there is, the more there is opportunity for corruption, and steps are being taken by Ukraine to cut down the time it takes to open businesses. So corruption won't be wiped out overnight. What business tends to look for in the West is, are you taking the right steps forward? And people always want, the pace of change accelerated. But first-term governments, which effectively this one is, are unusual things. But they're all the same around the world. There's three things: what you inherited, what you're doing about it, and making sure that you've got a clear goal in wanting to clean up corruption. And the argument's usually about the pace of change.
You just said that the focus of the businesses is at the government's efforts to eradicate corruption, whether the government is taking the right steps. So in the eyes of the Australian businessmen, is Ukraine taking the right steps to wipe off corruption?
Well, as I said, the thing they tend to look at is the small things. So they look at opportunities. So are steps being taken in the initial legislative stages to try and reduce the opportunities for interference, if you want to have a lighter description of corruption. So the more there are steps in a process to open a business, to clear your tax, to get a development approval, the more difficulties there come in terms of any potential corrupt process. So what people are looking for, and I'm not qualified to comment domestically about the levels of corruption, but I can only tell you what people look for, and they say, okay, I want to simplify the system. A simplified system is more transparent, and a more transparent system means less business risk for investors.
I understand. Mr. Textor, talking about the reputational matters, in the beginning you said that a lot of Australians got to know Ukraine after the tragic events last year of downing the MH17.
Yes.
So is Ukraine known in Australia only because of MH17, or is there something else Australians know about Ukraine?
Well,
basically apart from MH17, what is the first thing which comes to mind when people in Australia talk about Ukraine?
Well, they see it as the last and newest outpost of European democracy in the Central East, as we term it, because we look at geography slightly differently on the bottom half of the world. Okay. So they see the tremendous potential, and the commonality is a strange one, actually, because you think of Australia, it's a nation that's, although ethnically diverse these days, is largely recently Anglo-Saxon. It doesn't fit comfortably and hasn't fitted comfortably for 50 years next to its neighbours. And so Australia sees this and they see, okay, there's Ukraine, and it's not sitting very comfortably with one of its neighbours. So there's an understanding of that. So there's that awareness. There's also a very large Ukrainian diaspora in Australia, and particularly in the major business centres of Sydney and Melbourne. And so there is knowledge of Ukraine and its history. I mean, many Australians looked into Ukraine, and the conversations you tend to have with Australians is, oh my God, Kiev was established as a major city, an outpost of Constantinople, whilst Moscow was a mud puddle in a paddock somewhere. So there is a broad and growing sense of Ukrainian history. And of course the Russian model is somehow the Ukraine, which I understand Ukrainians hate that description, because it's, and I would too, because it suggests that it's just a region. But there's an understanding that now that Ukraine is been through difficulties and is fiercely trying to do the right thing, and that's an important thing. And there's a moral connection. I forget the Ukrainian word for it, but it translates roughly into fairness. It's not fair. So one of the things that Australians admired, yes, through tragedy, as you say, through the MH17, but one of the things that Australians admire about Ukraine is, there you are, you're losing thousands to war, you've had such terrible difficulties with revolution and corruption in the past, and yet there was this outpouring of genuine support and emotion for a bunch of strangers from 17,000 miles away. And that was tremendously admired. So whilst there mightn't be much rational knowledge, I think there's a really interesting emotional connection based on this shared Ukrainian and Australian value of fairness. It's not fair that someone did that. It's not fair that someone's trying to stamp out your democracy. It's not fair that someone is not appreciating the unique historical significance of even this city alone.
Well, indeed, looks like there are a lot of similarities between Ukraine and Australia, which us and our viewers most likely haven't realized that. Mr. Textor, many thanks for coming to us and talking to us on such a short notice. This was Volodymyr Suluv for Ukraine Today, together with the strategy consultant from Australia, Mr. Mark Textor. Thank you for watching us.